Colleen Stover from the Aerospace Corporation. Welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm here at the 75th Annual International Astronautical Congress in Milan, Italy, and I'm pleased to have Ludwig Moeller, Director of the European Space Policy Institute.
Pleasure.
And Jamie Morin, the Executive Director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. So thank you both for sitting here for just a minute. I know I've grabbed you off the floor and I want to just ask you some questions about some things. So thank you. I'll start with you, Ludwig. Sustainability. So the topic of the conference this week is about responsible space for sustainability. Sustainability means different things to different people. I'm learning that very fast. It can mean anything going from design to launch to operations to the demise, as well as other things. So how does ESPI, European Space Policy Institute, how do they approach sustainability, and how might that affect or kind of drive some of the efforts and research that you guys do?
I should say that the Institute really works across the whole spectrum of space. So we really start about purpose, why in fact you actually would do space. Talking about green and exploration, security and defense, science. And then we look into really what we say underpinning layers, and one of the two is really space as an asset. So we look into what do you need from space? You need orbits, you need frequency, you need safety, and this is where sustainability fits. So we have this in fact as one of our research lines in the system. And on your point on what actually sustainability stands for us, it's really two things. It's sustainability in space. So you want to make sure, when you talk about debris, you talk about making sure the orbits are safe in which you are flying, but also sustainability for Earth. So what you use space for to really help sustainability on ground. I'm talking energy transitions and the likes. And this for us is really, I would argue, it's probably 20% of what we do is looking into that aspect, which is elementary, to be able to do anything you want to do in space.
Right. And so that's kind of sustainability of the space environment above the Kármán line, as well as on Earth below the Kármán line, if you will.
Yes, both of this, yes. In space and from space.
Very so. So how about, if anyone is watching this instead of listening on our podcast, Jamie Morin and I are sharing microphones. So if you want to have a little laugh and you're listening to the podcast, be sure to tune into the show, because then you can watch us passing the mic back and forth. So, and so how does that, what about for Center for Space Policy and Strategy? How do you guys, or we, because I am one of the family, how would you say that the center kind of focuses on sustainability, what the approach is, and how that might drive some of our research?
So, Colleen, I would say it's actually substantially similar. We are very much focused on thinking about space's contributions to the betterment of life on Earth. Right? We do space because it's interesting and exciting, but we do it primarily in order to advance humanity, and the vast majority of humanity for the foreseeable future will be living here on Earth. But so we also think in terms of terrestrial sustainability and orbital sustainability. And we like to think of it in the terms that maybe an economist would use, of thinking about the positive and negative externalities that come from space activity. So for an economist, an externality is something that's not priced into a good or service. And so if I am emitting pollution as I produce a space vehicle or launch a space vehicle or re-enter a space vehicle, that's a cost that's borne by others, not just myself. Yeah. Similarly, though, the positive externality is when my activity produces something that's of value to others and that they don't have to pay for. Classic example is positioning, navigation, and timing, provided by the U.S. GPS constellation and several other navigation constellations around the world. No one charges for that. It's created an enormous amount of economic value. So when we think about sustainability of space and sustainability from space, we're really thinking about how can we make sure that we're still able to produce those benefits for the future. For us at Aerospace, because we are in the work of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, building on the technical foundations of the Aerospace Corporation as a whole, we're able to use experts like Marlon Sorge, who's one of the world's leading experts on debris and reentry issues. And Marlon, as part of both our Center for Orbital Reentry and Debris Studies and the Center for Space Policy and Strategies, able to give us this really strong technical foundation of understanding the issue, understanding the environment. Similarly, Karen Jones's work, thinking about life cycle analysis, environmental life cycle for activities conducted in space, has really helped to open our eyes to thinking in terms of a circular economy for space. That's an ambition. That's not a today, but we need to chart a course there. And that's really how we try to think about issues like sustainability.
Yeah. No, that's great. Using that technical backplane is definitely unique. So Ludwig, let's zero in a little bit more. What are some, in terms of safety and sustainability, what are some core messages or recommendations that SB is kind of looking at when it kind of thinking about safety or security, sustainability, all these things, all the S's?
Let's just start with the policy impact. I mean, we are based in Austria, in Vienna, in fact, and Austria is part of their national space strategy, has sustainability high on their agenda. And we are about to launch a center of expertise for space and sustainability. And that is part of our effort really to resonate with what is really a policy demand, something recognized. It can be, in that case, it's a single country in Europe, but it's an increasing number of European governments that have this on their agenda. So it is in itself a policy impact activity. Secondly, having said that, there is a lot of talk, there is a lot of strategy, there is a lot of declaration of ambition, and I could say in the European case there's not always the same follow-up in terms of funding and action. That is due to the complexity of Europe in terms of decision making. You have national programs, you have EU programs, ESA programs, so it has to be a collective effort, which is increasing. You have the EU SST, for instance, which is quite prominent, and they do very good work. But this is something we really need to step up. So my appeal really to the system, European system, is really to take that step from the ambition to the action. Another point which I believe is really maybe a universal point, when you go and talk to people, we had the pleasure in Japan recently at a sustainability summit. We, between ourselves, talk a lot about the threat of the debris. This is a negative message in a way. We see rockets explode and we talk about debris and pollution in orbits. And we need to be aware that this is shaping opinion and public perception on space. And I think the narrative should include, also when you talk about sustainability and safety of orbits, why you want to do this, because this is about the opportunity, what space can do once you have those safe orbits, and why you need these orbits. So the positive messaging and the narrative, I think, is a really an important thing, and sometimes we are a bit on the other side of this. Last but not least, I was thinking also in Japan, we talk about this in the US, we talk about this in Japan, we talk about sustainability in Europe. It could be a topic where really you try to join forces globally and different initiatives, not only regulatory, but really try and do things, bits and pieces of a federation that tries to address this problem, but in a kind of coordinated, I don't want to say programmatic, but a framework that really goes beyond the ad hoc, and sometimes you meet and sometimes you do something bilaterally. I would say maybe an international space station kind of thing for sustainability in space. Interesting. So getting the world together behind sustainability, yes, without actually making them prescriptive rules, but yes, the framework of that, right? We are the world. I love it.
So, again, this is an area where I really want to commend the work of SB. I think they've done a really nice job of laying out how in many areas we have a multitude of efforts underway simultaneously, taken by many different actors of different character. And, being able to systematically lay that out, measure the degree to which there's commonality and divergence among the approaches, and particularly among the stakeholders, has been a strength of ASPE's work. Coming back to the broader topic of sustainability and your point, Ludwig, about the positive framing, I think that's super important. Think about an issue like rocket emissions. It appears to be an emerging challenge as the rate of launch goes up, and the rate of launch going up is due to an enormous expansion of economic activity in space, which is delivering real benefits to people on Earth. But we have to think seriously about that issue. On the other hand, we are now in a period where people are able to take advantage of multispectral and hyperspectral imaging from space. So using cameras that can see wavelengths of light that the human eye could never see, and they can use that to track chemical emissions on the surface of the Earth. You think about this now in the context of a potential global agreement on climate. Think about this in, when we had arms control treaties through the Cold War, a critical component of that was how do you verify compliance? If we're going to take actions that are costly, we want to know other parties are doing the same. Well, we haven't gotten to global climate verification yet, but we now have space technologies emerging, flying on orbit, that could enable verification of future agreements. And things like this, could yield 10, 100, 1,000-fold the climate benefit that you have to balance against the climate impact that space legitimately has. And so I think thinking in terms of that positive and negative and what's the balance there, many times these space technologies are going to offer an open door to many-fold benefits beyond the costs that they impose.
If I can echo that, you mentioned climate monitoring. A lot of the variables in climate change today are monitored from space. And I was just thinking, coming back to the idea of maybe doing a coordinated effort on space safety, you could actually think about the way that we have an awareness of how occupied space is. What are the risk levels? On every first of the year you could have the parameter, it's the state of space, if you like, where actually we all know this is filling up, there are some statistics, but to get into a framework, it's like climate change variables. You could think about a few KPIs that try to capture what is the state of space up there. It is filling up, and how do we measure that? To make it more tangible and also measure points over time. And I like this comparison with the climate monitoring, because we just apply it to the state of the orbits in that case.
Nice. So the idea of putting a positive spin on I guess sustainability and the orbital.
Yeah, and I think this is super promising, and it also gets to the point that we shouldn't be fatalistic, right? This is not a question where humanity doesn't have the ability to change its future. And so we are, I think, in a moment where with things like orbital crowding, we can make choices that make this easier or harder for ourselves. We're at this seminal moment in management and coordination of traffic in space. We've seen in just the last several years a 5-fold increase in the number of active satellites on orbit in just a handful of years. I would argue that the impacts that we have seen from that 5-fold increase have been less than some of us would have predicted 5, 6, 7 years ago. And one of the reasons for that is an enormous share of that growth has been in the hands of a single company, which has all the economic incentives to avoid polluting its own orbits. But we're at this seminal moment because in the next 5 years, there will be several companies operating at large scale, from several countries. And so the cross-corporate and international aspects are now moving to the fore. And we're transitioning to a much more democratized domain where there will be many more stakeholders. And from a policy perspective, that makes things more complicated, but it means we're in a moment where we can make choices that could really make a difference to how that's handled.
Yeah. If I can also echo on this, you mentioned the business behind this, the opportunities behind this, the positive side, what you actually get out of all these constellations that are being deployed. Talking about the value of space, we did analysis on our side also to really look into what space can actually do for the wider economy. This is not space economy. This is not the return on invest of a space company in a contract. This is about the capability, data and services in particular that space offers to sectors like energy and transport and digital and many, many others. And if you do this, one thing you find is that space is not so different from other transversal research-intensive domains like semiconductors, batteries, pharmaceuticals are typical examples. And what you find in these sectors of innovation is they actually have a multiplier into the wider economy of up to 7. Now, I'm not saying this is a one-to-one case in the case of space, but there is certainly a case to be made that goes beyond the space economy to the economy of space for the wider economy.
Right. So how space supports the economic value of space, if you will. And I've had this idea about the value of space, or I heard something recently. People instead of my term, the value for space, the term was space for life. So how space benefits life on Earth. But how do you measure that? Like, that's so many intricate measurements. It would seem almost like the happiness index, right? So if you could take the happiness index and boil that down and follow the line to how space actually feeds into the happiness index, that might be an interesting metric.
There is a shortcut. The shortcut is that you could argue that prosperity is a source of happiness. If you have an economy that supports prosperity, people have a chance maybe to be happier. It's not a guarantee, but it may help you. Mm-hmm. And then you actually look into the different parts of life where actually what space does helps your prosperity, productivity, and you name it. But also environmental issues, how we connect to each other, how we work remote. I mean, there are many domains, and this is part of this whole package.
Yep.
As a songster once said, if money can't buy happiness, I guess I'll have to rent it. We are, I don't think it is actually a reasonable ask to fully quantify the multiplier effects of space technology on the broader economy. I think there's a lot of work to be done to get kind of the first order and second order effects and measure them well. And in the United States, the National Space Council has been investing in developing better statistics of the total economic impact of space in the U.S. economy. But one of the real dilemmas or even fundamental tensions in understanding space's impact is that space succeeds best when it is most transparent. Again, the GPS example is, I think, a really good one. You don't need to know that a dot on your phone comes from space in order to benefit from it. And you don't need to know that a weather forecast model for the path of a hurricane is profoundly informed by space technology in order to know you need to evacuate. So many of these benefits are increasingly invisible to the beneficiaries. That's a political and communications problem for the space sector, but in a sense it's an overwhelming success because space is no longer exotic, it is deeply integrated.
It is a political challenge. I would agree that transparency is good. It's just like electricity, right? You just have a plug in the wall and you get electricity and you don't really mind how this is really happening. but it has a downside. Take semiconductors. When take the case of Europe, and in the States maybe similarly, there's been a time when it was underestimated that this is not just a commodity that you procure and you get from somewhere, because it creates dependencies in car manufacturing and what a car. There was a time in Europe not so long ago when you couldn't get the car because it didn't have the chipset it required, because the chipset was not supplied from within Europe. So the awareness that you need also to work on the dependencies, the key enablers, I think that there has been an enormous shift in Europe to think about supply, and it's probably true also for space. That doesn't diminish the fact that yes, it should be transparent, people shouldn't be concerned about the complexities to actually get this going, but when it comes to policy decisions, funding decisions, to also look into manufacturing of things, getting the innovation going, to make sure you have the full picture, not only the service. I think this is important to also communicate.
Yeah, no, and I think certainly the COVID pandemic has brought these things to light, as well as the kind of increased conflict in areas of the world that we get things from, right? In terms of supply chain.
Energy supply is a prominent example in Europe.
Right, exactly. So I wanted to be sure to, we're about 2/3 of the way through our talk, so I wanted to be sure to touch on things of the future as well. So what are some, and I'll start with you, Jamie, what are some major decision points in the U.S. In the next few years? Where do you see space policy key decisions and thinking needs to happen?
So the CSPS is on the cusp of releasing one of our really critical reports. This is one we do every 4 years ahead of a presidential election and transition in the U.S., and we call it Space Agenda, in this case 2025. We're really, with a book like that, trying to lay out what are all of the major issues facing the nation that a presidential transition offers an opportunity to re-examine, potentially shift direction, and what is the intellectual framework for approaching those kinds of questions so that we can understand, the options that are available. So that study, we ended up focusing in on three major categories of issues. One was, what does it mean to lead and compete in today's world? It's an increasingly complex question. Geopolitical environment is challenging, and the democratization of space means it is a much more competitive environment in terms of the economic activity. So the second major theme that papers focused around is, what does it look like to catalyze commercial activity in the space sector? Again, in this increasingly democratized world with lots of significant players, and in light of the concern about supply chains and things like that Ludwig just brought up, there is an effort to do some more near to shore sourcing for components wherever possible, which is affecting the competitive environment. A third area that we address is really, what are the new value models? And this comes to getting at also some of the kind of space enterprise-wide constraint issues like spectrum usage in a increasingly crowded environment, but also where are we going with the exploration agenda? What does it mean to transition to commercial space stations in low Earth orbit from governmental activity? What about the moon and our cislunar ambitions? How are we approaching those? So those are some of the issues that we're addressing in 16 chapters on as we look to this presidential transition period. And we're looking forward to engaging with the various agencies in the United States, with international partners who care a lot about where U.S. policy is going, and with the presidential transition teams as they come in after the conclusion of our election.
Excellent, yeah. And so, Ludwig, how about for SB? And I'll ask you to go ahead and kind of address that, the near term as well as far term. Like, what do you see maybe as some key decision and thinking that needs to happen closer in, or what are you guys doing now? And then maybe even look out a decade or so, maybe to 2040 or something like that.
Well, we just, last year we issued Ep.143, which is our proposal, it's the vision for Europe, where Europe should stand. At the end, it's not us to implement, and like in your case, there are different structures that actually will then put programs in space, and there are two milestones really happening right now, talking about the short to midterm. Every 3 years, in the case of Europe, there is a ministerial of the ESA, the European Space Agency. This is happening the year from now, November next year. And those are funding decisions. Last time it was in the range of 17, 18 billion. So this gives you an idea. This is a 3 years horizon. That is still the bigger part of what Europe puts publicly into space. 80% of the European space budget is really attached to nations, and most of this is going through ESA. So this is the big milestone coming up. Question will be, how do we continue on what is a stronghold for Europe, which is space applications, so Copernicus, Earth observation, navigation, telecommunications. There is the idea to put up a new secure constellation also on the European side. And at the same time, also the European Commission is preparing what is the next framework program. This is every 7 years, and it starts in 28, but it's being prepared now. So those are the topics of the 12 months to come, and attached to that big funding decisions. Now, how does this fit into a longer term perspective? What are the real strategic questions for Europe? I would argue, shortcut is there are two, simplified. The biggest one and the game changer for Europe is since 24th of February 22, the war on Ukraine. I think this has led to a complete shift in the perception on what security and defense means for Europe, and that is also reaching space. And we're still in the process to see how the space system will accommodate this. And this is something that is really at the heart of the debate, because you may know that about 50% of the global funding in space is from that sector, and in Europe that is not at all the case. And so the question is really, how do we deal with this in Europe? The question on security being much more than the military complex. This is critical infrastructure protection. This is civil protection. This is many things of civilian life also. This is extreme weather events. This is economic security. It's a whole domain of question to be asked, and this is something we are working on right now. The other point is really, you said it also, going more global. It's more international, and we need to connect. We need to see space as a tool of diplomacy. I mean, the US is doing this already. Europe, I think, is going to develop more of this element. And I think those are the questions that will really shape the years to come. I could add a third one, which is really the verticalization of space, let's call it. This is really getting into what I said before, the different sectors of the economy, transport and energy and digital and the likes, to really make that step, which is a task of a decade.
Interesting. So that you kind of talked about Europe maybe growing indigenous capabilities in terms of defense and security, but then also going outside of Europe to branch out and to partner with other countries a little bit more.
In ESPI, if you look into our publications, we will always say a strong Europe as a partner to the world. We believe that you need to also have a certain own capability, but you use it to really work with the like-minded and in a partnership. And I gave the example on sustainability. That could be one of these examples to really work together.
Yeah. And so I'll ask you, Jamie, to maybe kind of think about how you might say that the center, the CSPS, is going to be thinking in a kind of further, a little bit longer timeline, and then also give some closing thoughts for our audience.
Yeah, I think we should start. Ludwig brought up kind of the geopolitical environment, and if we want to continue to deliver space's benefits to humanity, the overriding consideration is avoidance of major power conflict on Earth that will, with great likelihood, extend to space and would put at risk the ability of the sector to continue to deliver these benefits. So that's got to be sort of project one. We can't be satisfied with just doing that, right? But that US, Europe, the other global players need to take these issues very seriously. We saw from the earliest days of the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia, space systems attacked with cyber weapons, and now we're increasingly seeing very active use of jamming. Ukraine does not have satellites of their own, and so we have not seen kinetic attacks on satellites in orbit. But we could in a future conflict, and that would be a very serious matter as part of a very serious conflict that would be serious in many other dimensions. But in the space dimension, you're talking potentially centuries of impact, which is it's a long time to pay a price. So that's piece one, right? But the second piece really is thinking seriously about institutions and a path to cooperation to address both the maximization of the benefits we take from space, which involves data sharing on problems like climate. It involves continuing to work globally to harmonize all of the positioning, navigation, and timing systems, a whole host of technical and policy issues like that. And then it also involves grappling with these forward-looking issues like the crowding topics we talked about up front, and really just being creative and proactive. All of the major players will seek some degree of strategic autonomy, but all the major players also need to recognize an interdependence. And in the case of the US and Europe, I think there's enormous opportunity to consciously embrace areas of interdependence while also having areas of autonomy and also having areas where competition is an important part of the relationship. But there will be significant areas where the collective benefit can be advanced by clever policymakers willing to, take some risks, seize opportunities, and we're super excited to sketch those things out.
Thank you. And Ludwig, would you like to offer our audience any closing thoughts, or do you want to comment on anything Jamie just said?
Well, first of all, I would certainly support what you said, absolutely. And then I make my task easy, and I would just simply say, let us really develop a better narrative of being positive about the opportunities that talks to people that are not us, that talks to not only the politicians, but also the people in the street, to understand the benefit. You said climate change monitoring, maybe also deal with adaptation to a changing climate, but many, many other domains that are there to come. And I think we are very much trained to be between us, and we need to be trained to go out and speak the language of people out there and really do this in a positive manner. And I think this is so essential. It is really the one thing that I'm profoundly convinced will be the one that scales up space to something beyond what we're used to.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated to think about how space, improves agricultural yield, or helps us monitor marine health, or even can monitor human trafficking and all kinds of things. It's not just it's not just tracking your package on your phone or ordering your pizza, right? So there's a lot of things. So thank you very much, both of you, for being here today and taking the time. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
I look forward to more partnerships that we can do like this in the future.
Thank you for your time.
So everyone, thank you very much for joining us at the Space Policy Show. You can also find more podcasts and more of our in-depth research at csps.aerospace.org. Bye for now.